mainstream media begins to talk about the other tolls of the COVID-19 pandemic, AOC calling for First Amendment violations, and China's authoritarianism ramps up on its citizens. All this and more on Breaking on the Daily. Now, let us begin with that article that I was talking about with regard to the COVID-19 death toll. Because the Wall Street Journal came out with a report about how the COVID-19 death toll is even worse than it looks. Now, what I want to talk about this is not necessarily the numbers, because though the numbers are quite interesting on their own, and I think a bit misleading in certain circumstances, and what they're saying is a bit misleading. The title's a bit misleading, and rather, I want to talk about some of the language that is used in the article, because throughout this article, and I know I'm kind of picking on the Wall Street Journal more than I would normally, because I literally just got done on Wednesday with talking about another one of their articles that was really terrible. And this one is not quite as bad, though I think it has a bit of poisonous language that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be seen by the people. You need to be able to see it, and you need to be able to see that what's happening here. Now, what this article specifically does is it talks about how, well, the pandemic has its death toll understated because we're only including things which were caused by COVID-19. Now, the problem with that is that they state over and over again that this is caused by the pandemic. When, in fact, most of these deaths that they're talking about in terms of excess deaths that don't have anything to do with the actual disease itself, or at least aren't directly caused by it, are instead caused by the response to COVID-19 in large respect. Because of our authoritarian lockdowns, limits on travel, and all of these sort of governmental policies that have come into place over the last year, we have seen an uptick in particular forms of death, whether that be suicide, though the only place that we've actually seen data with regard to that is Japan, because most of the rest of the world does not have suicide numbers updated to this point. Most countries have their suicide numbers backdated by about 2 years. They don't actually go into it very much. And yes, part of that is they're trying to actually investigate the actual cause of death just so that they don't, get the numbers wrong, but at the same time, it's kind of, it's convenient at the very least that they aren't seeing that uptick, or at least we haven't seen much data with regard to it, mostly because we just don't update suicide data that quickly. But anyway, beyond getting off into the weeds here, also we have things that are more data driven and something you can more readily point to, and that is that is deaths caused by diseases that are not COVID-19. Because what has happened over the last year, in large respect because of lockdowns and other such things, is you have de-incentivized actually going to the hospital for anything that isn't COVID-19. You've ended up in a scenario in which everyone believes that the hospitals are completely full and they won't help you anyway. And so what ends up happening is that a lot of people who should be going to the hospital aren't, either because of a myriad of factors, but some of which being they don't feel like, oh, it's not essential, oh, I have a heartburn or whatever. But it's not essential for me to go to the hospital, despite the fact that might be, some huge problem. It might be portent to an actual heart attack, for all we know. It could be any number of things. I'm not a medical expert, so, I couldn't give you an exhaustive list. But beyond that, calling this a cause of the pandemic is poisonous, because what it does is it makes it so that you obfuscate the actual cause of what's happening. When you say that the extra suicides, or when you say that the deaths due to other illnesses are all the result of the pandemic exclusively, you blame the pandemic entirely, including intent. You blame it entirely. You lay off the blame, and more importantly, from people and how they responded to the pandemic. Because we have responded to the pandemic in very, very terrible ways that have ended up in many excess deaths that have nothing to do with COVID-19, at least not inherently. Yeah. This article is truly frustrating in that sense, because though a lot of the data that's provided in this article is in fact very interesting and very useful, this poison language ends up making it so that the article is almost unreadable to me, because I won't read it and I see these small little things, these small little tricks they do that make it so that you can only take the article in some particular ways and assume some conclusions that shouldn't be assumed, as I've stated with regard to how the deaths are actually caused. And this is a more pervasive problem throughout all of media than just what happens in the Wall Street Journal. Poisonous language and poisonous words happen all over the place. It's a very common thing you'll see in headlines. Headlines that include or don't include certain things to color your perception in a particular way. It is linguistic poison. It poisons your mind, prevents you from actually seeing what's going on in a clear light by not necessarily saying anything that is directly inaccurate, because if they said something directly inaccurate, it would simply be too obvious. No, rather they say something which is not necessarily directly inaccurate, but something which colors your perception of everything else in an inaccurate way, and that's what ends up happening. And this is a common trope among media, and you see lots of people calling this out all the time. But I want to talk more about how you actually should be able to approach these sorts of scenarios, and how you should be able to tell when someone is doing something like that. And a lot of times you'll see it in places in which you're seeing them play with definitions a lot, especially when they're playing with definitions in a way that they aren't making it extremely clear. Because I've made my position clear in the past that I don't believe that the changing in definitions is inherently terrible or wrong. It just depends on the context, why you're doing it, and how transparent you are about it. It's totally fine to me if you come up and say, well, I'm going to use this word as meaning this, and you explicitly say, yeah, this has this its own special change in definition for me in this conversation, in the context of this conversation, because it has this particular use in this conversation that I want to be able to use as shorthand rather than having to say all of this over and over and over again. That's totally fine to me, especially if your reasoning for why this definition should be changed for the purposes of that conversation is reasonable. What becomes unreasonable is when you don't do the whole explanation bit and simply say, this definition means this, and then end it at that. You see this in common usage for something like racism. When you see the prejudice plus power and that sort of redefinition of the term, they don't actually explain to you most of the time as to why the definition needs to be changed, the inefficiencies in the original definition, why it lacks certain usages that could be rectified by adopting a new definition, why the new definition is the way it is. All of these things remain mostly unexplained unless you go very deep into their actual writing and a lot of their core doctrine. If you don't go to places like white fragility or whatever, or Ibram X. Kendi's writing, you're not going to see a very clear picture as to why they actually want to do these certain things, why they want to change these words. And that is, while not dispositive of poisonous language, is at least a sign to which you should be aware of, and which you should say, okay, if someone is changing the definition of a word, but they aren't actually explaining to me why it's happening, then I should be wary, at the very least, of why they're actually doing that. Another scenario in which you'll see poisonous language is you'll see words used where the definition is unclear from the very beginning, or where you'll see words that are uncommonly used in a lot of cases, and not just uncommonly used, but also uncommonly used in the particular discussion that you're talking about. You'll see certain essentially dogmatic words that jargon. You'll see this a lot of cases. None of this is, of course, dispositive. It's just a sign that you should be looking out for. All of this you need to be looking out for and see, okay, this thing is happening. So they're trying to make me believe this particular definition. So if they're doing this, I need to find out why. Because once you find out why, then you can figure out whether it is truly poisonous language or just bad explanation. Because, of course, there is a realm of incompetence in this as well. You need to watch out for that as well, because sometimes you can actually accuse someone of having poisonous language, of improperly redefining things or defining things wrongly without actually understanding their original intent and end up being wrong. Of course that's possible. But man, we've gotten out into the weeds on that one. But we need to move on, because on top of more pandemic news and more political news is Joe Biden has now unveiled his $1.9 trillion spending plan. And, of course, the spending plan is filled to the brim with nonsense and worthless garbage. You have things like $350 billion in state and local government aid, and what that essentially means is that they are going to bail out certain state and local governments, meaning the blue ones that are terribly run and are going bankrupt currently. And they're going to bail them out, essentially, which is an utterly ridiculous concept. Really, we shouldn't be bailing out anything, but it's just something that you're going to see. Really, a lot of these states need to hurt for their decisions. If your state is running poorly, if your state is going over budget consistently over years, of course it should face the consequences of such and need to actually change its policies in order to readjust, in order to actually have a better in order to be in a better position going forward. You need to have that sort of stuff. And more on top of that, they also have $170 billion for K through 12 schools and institutions of higher education. A completely ridiculous thing, considering the fact that the K through 12, because what a lot of this money is going to end up going to is the school unions. It's going to go to the teachers, the administrators, all those sorts of people who have been clamoring for schools to be closed, but them still to get paid throughout the rest the whole last year. K through 12 schools are pretty much a lost cause in a lot of cases. There is usage for K through 12 and college schools, and I'm not saying schooling as a concept is worthless, of course. Education is one of the most important things you can do for a person. Rather, the sort of institutionalized schools that we have, the particular institutions that we're talking about, are the ones at fault. We are looking at a scenario in which K through 12 schools, in large respect, only serve to prime people for a certain political ideology that makes them almost subservient to it. It ends up in a scenario in which they have many people have been, and many children have been indoctrinated into believing particular things. And a lot of this comes back to the idea of poisonous language and poisonous mind. A lot of poisonous language actually gets started in K through 12 schools. You get a lot of very poisonous arguments, very poisonous language that gets thrown around in schools. A lot of people's dependence upon certain authorities and utter worship of such ends up being bred within public schools in a lot of cases. You see certain institutions be elevated above the level of of any given human into the realm of essentially infallibility. You see many institutions be treated like that, and the CDC, many governmental institutions are a big part of that. You also see a lot of things like the glorification, once again, of a lot of governmental institutions, but also certain educational institutions. A lot of the education institutions, for those who don't know, glorify themselves as being inherently more credible than any other institution. If you've ever gone to a college class ever, most college classes in which you have to write a report in which you have to cite things, these places will put themselves on a pedestal above any other given institution. It's evident in how they do research. For those who don't know, in college research, if you're citing a educational or governmental institution, that is considered inherently more credible than any other place. So if you take something from a .com, even if the information is accurate and done well, then they will inherently treat it as less accurate. A particular story I remember is that my science teacher, chemistry, I think it was, criticized me for bringing up a certain way to retrowrite plastics because I got the procedure for it from a YouTube video. This being despite the fact that retrobite formula actually does work and actually does preserve old electronics into becoming more white rather than having that yellowy feel. And the criticism was not, this isn't the most efficient method. Certain of these steps or processes are unnecessary. You only need to do, some of these. Others of them are worthless. No, it was that, it doesn't work. You shouldn't trust that. You just shouldn't trust that. You shouldn't even try it. It's a ridiculous thing. Because that retrobite method does work. According to every scrap of information I have access to, that retrobite method works. And that was kind of a weird scenario for me. It felt very strange to see someone ostensibly committed to the scientific method just reject someone who was doing something that inherently was at least had the potential to be accurate, and throwing them out as worthless simply because they did not belong to any particular institution that she trusted. It was quite silly, I think. It was quite the sight to behold. I was quite bewildered by it. Man, we've gotten off in the weeds. You also just to go back down the list. Now I'm just going to speed through this because I'm not going to get through this if I talk on every single point. Next, we have direct payments of $14,000 to most Americans, costing around $320 billion, according to a Breitbart News estimate. Enhanced unemployment benefits, increasing payments by $400 per week. Oh, that sounds terrible. Through the end of September. $50 billion for COVID-19 testing. That's whatever. $20 billion for towards a national vaccine program. Just do it statewide. I don't like national programs as a general rule. Raising the child tax credit to $3,000 per child, making it fully refundable for 2021. I prefer just a tax break at that point. The non-spending proposals include hiking the federal minimum wage to $15 per hour. Sounds like a good way to go into a depression. Extending the eviction and foreclosure moratoriums until September. Extended family leave. I think a lot of this is in likelihood going to be a precipice for a lockdown. I feel like if this gets passed through the Senate and the House, which in all likelihood it will because Republicans are cowards, and at this point, at the point in which this would possibly be passed, the Democrats will hold the Senate slightly. I think this is going to be a precipice for a national lockdown, because a lot of this seems to be explicating that. The extended eviction moratoriums until the end of September and the unemployment benefits till the end of September really sounds like they're trying to be able to justify lockdowns for that long. And this is really going to cause a lot of problems. But, okay, to move on from that segment. AOC has said that Congress may form a commission to rein in media after Capitol riot. Now, this is blatantly against the First Amendment. I mean, it's so blatant that it isn't really worth explaining why. Reining in media and essentially taking control of certain media, which is what that means. This is another example of kind of poisonous language. Not as poisonous. It's more just misleading. Rein in and control are fundamentally the same terms. They mean essentially the same thing. But when you say rein in, it makes it sound as though you're saying, oh, we just need to take the reins because they're going out of control. They're doing all this sort of nonsense that we don't want to happen. But in reality, what it just means is that she wants to take control. She wants to limit dissension from what her particular positions are. And this is not out of line for the left. I mean, ostensibly, AOC is a populist leftist, ostensibly. But according to communists, of course, she's a center politician. And man, that's just an insane thing. I'm not going to even get into it. But she said that, we need to rein in media. And how this is going to, in all likelihood, manifest itself, it's going to manifest itself as a limitation on what certain things can be said. if I were to guess, in all likelihood, it's going to limit advocacy for certain voter integrity outcomes and certain voter integrity priorities. It'll likely result in certain things like, oh, you can't say that mail-in voting is a problem or anything like that. It'll likely end up in that. And even me saying just that might end up getting me banned from YouTube. But whatever. I don't really care about YouTube. My impressions fell off a cliff in November, so I don't really care. But, because, they're suppressing people who talk about politics on YouTube and aren't major media corporations. But anyway, to move on from that, something I want to talk about is certain people who have been discovered to have been at the Capitol trespassing. This being CNN's Jake Sacker penetrating the Capitol with a member of BLM Antifa. Someone named John Sullivan, I think it was. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was John Sullivan. Now, this John Sullivan character is from Utah, and he was actually arrested overnight. And there is certain things going around about how, oh no, he wasn't a part of Antifa. He was apolitical. He wasn't apolitical. It's hard to look at this guy who is inherently anti-system and inherently anti the government. He is anti-government in a lot of ways. And say, oh no, he's just apolitical. He's just apolitical. And yeah, it is true that certain groups within Antifa and BLM, I think mostly actually BLM, not really Antifa, had been, up in the months prior, saying, we don't really like this guy, he goes too far, or whatever. And he just incites things and gets people arrested and whatever. But to then say that, oh no, he's not a left-wing agitator when he goes to the Capitol riot, no, he's still right-wing. This guy seems to be one of the elements that actually spurred on the trespassing. And no, I'm not going to say it's insurrection, because it's not insurrection, it's trespassing. And no, that is not me defending it, all right? It's just me being accurate with regard to what it actually was. But of course, no one really cares about that, because they don't care about being accurate with regard to this particular situation, because it isn't politically viable for them. But whatever. I'm getting a bit off into the weeds. In this case, what I'm more interested in, rather than John Sullivan, is actually the CNN, the person who works for CNN, that being Jade Sacker. This is someone who has been on CNN multiple times, and actually, as far as I understand, works for CNN, who infiltrated the Capitol and trespassed on Capitol grounds, and then said, "We did it!" And then asked John Sullivan if he was filming, and acting as, and this video is quite insane in that, in this video, they're kind of acting like, I'm fairly sure they actually mention, don't mention, like, how we're connected to Antifa. If I remember correctly, it's been like a day or two since I've actually watched this video. But it is really quite insane. She is a reporter. She was working for on a CNN project, but she's also done work for NBC and NPR. And this person should be fired. This person should be fired. Certainly, if Elijah Shaper was arrested for simply being there, so should this reporter. But to move on to something that I think is actually kind of important, China has had a bit of a uptick in their authoritarian measures with regard to COVID, because Chinese freight drivers have been trapped in trucks and have faced discrimination because their truck's license plates have the Hubei province on it. Because for those who don't know and who haven't been really following China, the coronavirus has been very serious in Hubei as of very recent. And this has led to a lot of locals and such questioning the official data, because it really does look as though it's much worse than what China is leading on. And this has led to a massive lockdown in Hubei, with even Hubei drivers who are just kind of out driving freight trucks trying to get places are trapped in their vehicles, unable to leave them at all, and are not allowed to refuel, eat, go to stores, or stay in a hotel. These people are trapped there, and are going to be trapped there for the next 72 hours at the very least. The reason being is that they have to take nucleic acidic test certification. They have to actually take a test for COVID and have that come out within the last 72 hours in order to leave the city of Hubei. But the problem is that a lot of these people have not left the city before this even happened, and so because it happened very recently. And what's going on essentially at this point is that they're waiting to actually take these tests in order to leave the vehicle at all. And there's a high likelihood that some of these people starve in these vehicles. It is utterly insane that we are following China's pandemic plan, because that's what we've been doing for the past year. We have been the idea of lockdowns as a public health measure is something which originates in China. By and large, we don't use that, and the reason we don't is because it does not make sense to quarantine healthy people. It doesn't make sense. No logical person would say, yeah, you're healthy, you don't have any symptoms for anything? Yeah, go and stay in your home for a few weeks. That sounds like a good idea. Utterly ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous. But of course, we're taking all of our cues from China with regard to all of this. It's simply ridiculous, and it should be an outrage to the entire world that we're still taking this. Really, you need to cut down on how much you're trying to take out of China. And I know it's unavoidable for some people. And I know that some people have hobbies that only really get manufacturing out of China or whatnot. But try to find any alternative you can possibly find. Singapore has good manufacturing. Taiwan has good manufacturing. Vietnam has good manufacturing. Go there. Those are better places. Not perfect, obviously. No country is. But they're better than China. You really need to limit it. You really do. You need to find every place where this stuff's being manufactured in China. Let's limit it. Well, I'm not saying completely remove it, because that's kind of unfeasible. I'm not going to be unreasonable here. But limit it as much as you can, because we really do not want to support this authoritarian nonsense state. We do not want to support that. And that's where I'm going to leave you today. This has been Breaking on the Daily. I'm Kel Kidman, and I'm out.